Okay, welcome everybody, and it's a pleasure to see you here. I'm Jim Stock. I'm director of the Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability at Harvard. We are really excited, I am really excited to have the opportunity to discuss with André Hoffmann and Peter Vanham their new book on the new nature of business. Before we get started, let me just say a couple of words about the Salata Institute, which I think some of you know, but maybe some of you don't. We're only 2 years old, so we're a bit new on campus here. Our job, we sit at the center of the university, and we're the hub of climate and sustainability activities here at Harvard. Our mission is to drive impactful work in climate and sustainability on the world's most pressing problems. Harvard has a unique role to play in that. We have expertise across broad fields, whether that's business here today, whether it's in science, whether that's in health, policy, law. And because of these unique strengths across all of the university, we can really muster strong teams that make a difference in terms of real-world problems and real-world solutions in climate and sustainability. So we're really thrilled to have that opportunity in general, and we're especially thrilled to have the opportunity here to talk with André and Peter about their new book. It tackles big ideas about the evolution of natural capital and planetary stewardship and the role that corporations can play to support environmental sustainability. So let me first introduce the two of you, and then we'll start our conversation. The way this is going to work is we'll have some opportunity for André to make some initial remarks. I'll engage some questions, and then we'll open it to the audience for general Q&A. So André Hoffmann is a Swiss business leader and environmentalist. He's vice chair of Roche, one of the world's largest pharmaceutical and healthcare companies. Roche was founded by the Hoffmann family in 1896. He is also a member of the Board of Governors of the World Economic Forum, a former vice chair of the Worldwide Fund for Nature, or WWF, and a board member of several businesses and organizations that promote systems change, regenerative practices, and new norms of corporate leadership. He and his wife are also co-founders of the Hoffmann Institute at INSEAD, where he received his business degree. Peter Vanham is editorial director, leadership at Fortune, based in Geneva. He writes about the global economy, sustainability, stakeholder capitalism, and ESG. His previous books include Stakeholder Capitalism, written with World Economic Forum chair Klaus Schwab. His articles have appeared in the FT, Harvard Business Review, and Foreign Policy, among our other outlets. So let's just go ahead and get started. And I think it would be interesting, it'd be interesting to me, but also interesting to the audience, before we dive into this book, which has a lot of different facets, maybe you could, André, just share with us your journey, as it were, about how you came to the point where you were motivated to write this book and the evolution of ideas and your experiences that brought you to this point.
Thank you very much for the question. I hope the microphone works, because I installed it myself and I don't know how to use it.
Is it on?
There's a little red thing there. It's a good sign, I think. Yeah. But anyway, I can talk loud in the meantime, and I will certainly do it. I thank you very much for the question, and I must say I'm really quite excited about being here at the Harvard Business School as a speaker and not as somebody who comes and learns. I did myself an MBA degree in another school, INSEAD in Fontainebleau, and that was very much something that changed my life. So business teaching is something of interest. Now, why am I interested in talking about these things? There are two reasons. One reason is that I have, as we just heard in my reading, a little bit of interest in nature. My father was one of the founding members of WWF. I grew up in the nature reserve in the Camargue, and when at the same time as my family has also been the owners of one of the big pharmaceutical business. So in parallel, in my youth, these two completely different things, which we could have called opposites some years ago, but we are going to see that that is not the case anymore. On one side, a big corporation with all the responsibility that it entails, and on the other side, nature. And nature, not as just a species, but nature as a system. And how can we deal with that? So the cover of the book shows very clearly the place where we work. This is the Camargue, in the delta of the Rhone River, in the south of France. Now, what can unite the two? Well, science. When we looked at what was happening in the Camargue, my father being a zoologist, spent a lot of time trying to understand how nature works. His specialty at the time was birds. He was interested in bird migration. And then in the family business, what we are trying to do is to promote innovation. And innovation based on science, new ideas, yeah? Doing things that haven't been done before. And I realized over the years, after a lot of time spent in the NGO world, while at the same time sitting on the board of the family company for 28 years. I'm going to pause here because that's not what they teach you at business school. This is against corporate governance. But I chair the corporate governance committee, so it's okay. I just need to tell you how to do it. So the thing that these two things have in common is this approach of science. Try to be as rigorous as possible about what's happening around the place. So again, why am I interested to come to Harvard Business School? In Harvard Business School, in 1903 or 04, you started teaching MBA. You started teaching general management in order to be able to manage assets of companies in a way that is beneficial to the system. 1959, the first revision of the curriculum. 1959, 1960, I'm not quite sure, when the Ford Foundation influenced, and since then the curriculum has been practically unchanged. Not so much for innovation, but I think it's important to understand that the principles of managing companies as taught by the HBS haven't changed much. And that's precisely why I got sort of, not because of HBS, but because of management education not changing much, that I thought it was time to do something. And so, until now, the two aspects of that particular life are quite similar, but they start to diverge. Because suddenly I realized that, in fact, we are all, and this is an image we use in the book, we are all swimming in the same pool. So if we are trying to, on one side, to do something for nature and sustainability, and on the other side, trying to create value in business, we are still the same people, doing the same thing, and if one of us doesn't keep the water clean, it's going to be difficult to do it in the long term. So I think it's important to remember that we're all in this together. Where am I going with that? The idea that the business of business is something that has over the years been a little bit in the way, but that may be the subject of another day. Why do I want to change the future of the management education and how we are describing it in this book? Is because our family is the long-term owner of one of these businesses, and we want to make sure that that business is going to continue to exist for the long term. So to tie it all up, you have nature, you have business, you have long-term thinking, family ownership, transgenerational thinking, and how can we tie it all together? And that was very much the reason why I wrote this book. That could be the beginning of the conversation. Yeah, there's much more to say, but I'm not quite sure how to structure it.
Maybe that's a perfect transition into actually saying more about what the main thesis of the book is and what you're getting at in the book.
So I think it's important to understand that when I was born, there were about 3 billion people on the planet. Today there are 8 billion. And the 8 billion people on the planet live longer lives, better educated lives, healthier lives, infant mortality is at its lowest ever, than the 3 million did before. And because of that, I think it is fair to say that our current system has been a good idea. Has been, we have brought about the prosperity that we need. That's good. Now, but at what cost? That prosperity has had collateral damages and is still provoking collateral damages that are visible for all to see. We have lost 68%, so I should phrase it differently. The Living Planet Index as defined by the London Zoological Society for WWF has shown a decline of 68% over the last 60 years. That index is composed of vertebrate data in species and amount of biodiversity. It's a trend that we can just not continue. Every year we lose more species and we lose more biomass, and we lose more life. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. If you look at the other symptoms that are showing that the prosperity is not working, you just have to look around the place. forest fires, biodiversity loss, climate change, plastic pollution, huge adverse meteorological event. If you look at nature, but if you look at the social system, you can see that disparities are increasing. You can see that there's an awful lot of anger and angst among the young generation. If you look at your neighbors, you will see that some of them are not very happy with the current status quo, and that needs to be addressed as well if you want to go into sustainability. And then the third element, which for me is the most important one, is the individual person. How can we promote happiness and well-being among humanity individually? And you've noticed I've separated into three buckets because there are three buckets. We should look at the social capital, the human capital, and the natural capital when we talk about prosperity. We need to take and we need to measure the impact we are having on these three capitals in order to come and produce the value that we need for the sustainable growth. As you know, at the moment we only measure the fourth one, which is the financial flows. We actually have decided that humanity works, will be successful only if it concentrates on the financial flows. Make your business profitable and it will serve humanity. Well, I would contend that that is not the case. I think you can make a business profitable by taking into account the social, the human, and the natural capital, and their interdependencies before you come to the financial capital. So that's one of the themes that I would like to develop in the book, because if we don't get to that proper management, husbanding of these resources, social, human, and natural, we are not going to get to sustainable prosperity, which we need for the trip of humanity on the planet to be successful, because at some stage we are going to run out of the planetary boundaries. So we need to make sure that we include all this into the same thing. So maybe just a quick word on the three capitals. I mean, when I talk about human capitals, I talk about each one of us individually. What is it what drives us? What makes us happy? What makes us able to contribute? How can we become part of the system? Individually, you know, the Maslow pyramid, self-realization is really what we are aiming at. The second is the social capital, is what links us. You know, why have you decided to come here today rather than staying in front of the television to watch the football, or rather the soccer, as you say? The third one is nature, but nature not, sorry, before we leave the social is also about what we owe to each other. You know, what is the contract? What are our rights and obligations towards each one of us? And then the third one is nature, but nature not defined as the panda or the tiger or some emblematic species. Nature is defined as the life support system on Earth. If we lose nature, we as a apex species will disappear as well. So these three elements strike me as being important, and how do we use them to create the value we need? Well, one of the things I would like to bring about in the book is this idea of putting nature onto the balance sheet. We are behaving like if nature is inexhaustible. We are behaving like if nature is free for all. Well, it isn't. You know, clean air, pure water has a cost. It's not something that we can just take for granted. Not only has it a cost, it also has a finite quantity. At some stage it will stop. And so if you want to deal with it with the respect that it deserves, we are going to have to value it. And we're going to have to value it in a way that we all agree with. So it's a question of making sure that we put nature onto the balance sheet as an asset, as an opportunity, rather than just as a cost that we have to look after. So we move away from extraction and pollution, and we go towards regeneration. And that's a business opportunity in itself, and again, that's a suitable conversation to have. And then I think I've mentioned the three now, yeah?
So part of, you have this image in the book, is this, there being roots and trunk and then the branches, which are the various components of the transformation of a business enterprise, and at the core of that is the trunk. I think one of the things, the way you describe that is that you should reflect, or the corporate leaders should reflect on the corporate purpose, set goals that go beyond profits, and measure and disclose all your impacts and dependencies. So there's a lot to unpack there. But let me just start with the question. I'm thinking about this as an economist in the United States. So let me just start with the question of how in publicly traded companies it's possible to set these goals that go beyond profits. What does that actually mean? How does that get operationalized or competitive, if you're in a competitive industry, I think we understand if you have substantial monopoly power, then you have the flexibility to do that. Or if you're a privately held company, you might have the flexibility in the horizon to do that. But in a publicly held company with typically short time frames, that's a challenging situation. Of course, that describes most of the businesses in the United States.
Yes, so I mean, one of the things we've been trying to talk about in the book is giving examples of how you can do that in different corporations. So I would just refer to the one from our own family company, Roche. Over the years, what we've been able to create is a culture that focuses onto the service to the patient. So we have defined our purpose. Our purpose is doing today what the patient needs next. You see that there's a long-term characteristic of the target, and it focuses on the patient. Roche is not in the business to make money. Roche is not there to serve shareholders. Roche is there to serve the patient and make sure that we have that we contribute in a positive way to unmet medical needs. We can come up with innovation, and that we can constantly try to move towards the unmet medical need. Now, I know that's a bit of a contradiction for publicly listed companies who are usually measured on the quarterly earnings, and these quarterly earnings should be increasing so that the share price goes up so that everybody is happy. We are not managing the company for the share price, and I hope there is no financial analyst here. That would be very bad. And I think that in the long term, if you want to serve the patient properly, you need to be able to generate innovation, and if you want to generate innovation, you need to have a positive return. If you don't have a positive return, you cannot continue. I would contend that if you serve the patient well, you will get a positive return, but you should not start by getting the positive return, because then you will not serve the patient well. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I guess it gets around this question. I guess there's the follow-up question of you think about putting nature on the balance sheet in not just a figurative sense, but in a literal sense for companies. And so how does that actually work? And again, thinking about publicly traded companies, how does one proceed with that?
Well, first of all, we have to change the accounting system, and there are more and more norms coming in that direction. You know, if you really want to quantify impact, you have to be able to measure impact. You manage what you measure, and you have to make sure that we put something together. In Europe, the IFRS Foundation has started the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standard Board, which has provided some standards which allows you to measure nature, which allows you to measure impact on social and human, and we try to put that into the it's not yet mandatory, but there are a couple of organizations thinking of bringing them for publicly listed companies specifically. Now in the US you have SASB, which is the sort of equivalent, and which we hope to be able to harmonize with what's happening in Europe. So there are already ways of reporting onto these things, and you can decide to do it yourself if you really want to create value by taking into account nature. I have absolutely no doubt that regulation will come in the near future for doing this, and there is more and more of a push in that direction. Now, the question was, how do you instrumentalize it?
Yeah.
Well, if you get to the point where you can actually say that each one of these items can be itemized, rather than taking business decision only based on instant profitability, you can also look at the cost of the system, and that's really what we're trying to do. So there are a couple of companies providing these services, and at Roche we use one called Value Balancing Alliance, and we try to make sure that we introduce. In fact, it's based on work done by Professor Serafinis here at Harvard, George Serafinis.
So there's two parts of this. If we sort of get a little bit technical here, there's this issue of what's called double materiality, which differs in terms of the European treatment and the way the SEC has been thinking, at least in the carbon disclosure world here. So the double materiality has to do with the one direction. Single materiality is what's the effect of, let's say, biodiversity loss or nature, or just in the climate world, climate change on the company's financials. And then the double materiality part is what's the effect of the company on the other part of the system. So I think the accounting has to do, I guess there's both aspects of this, but much of the accounting has to do with the second part, the double materiality part. What's your thoughts about
this is a highly debated topic. There's a question of whether you should have single materiality or double materiality as a matter of corporate disclosures and corporate measurements. So I just would love to hear your thoughts on this. And I'm sorry if this is getting a little bit down in the weeds here, but it's a big debate between the US and the EU, and even within the EU, the accounting approach.
Well, there's so many things to unpack there, but I will start with single and double materiality. Single materiality has a lot to do with the carbon accounting, which was the first part of this conversation. You know, when you issue carbon, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, you have an impact on society, and that is something you can measure. And you can control because you just look at the CO2 level that you are emitting. When you're talking about biodiversity, when you're talking about impact you're having on the social, the human, the natural capital, when you're talking about integrated reporting, it becomes intensely more complicated. And it then develops much more this notion of consensus. We need to agree on standards before we put them in. Now, the European Commission has come up with a proposal of the Green Plan and the Green Taxonomy 3 years ago, and I put them for discussion so that we can all agree what sort of standards we would like to use. The reality is that businesses have pushed back dramatically, saying, you know, we just can't do that sort of thing, it's too complicated. And that the European Union deal is starting to lose its teeth. In the US, the thing is the opposite is, you know, the fact that ESG is no longer seen as very relevant is a good indication of the fact that people have thought for a while that this would be the best possible way of making a profit, you know, nature as an investment opportunity. And this is much more subtle than that. This is not about the next quarter, it's about much longer term considerations. And so we still have a little bit of a battle there. But as long as there is no consensus around it, it's not going to happen. We need to make sure that there is agreement at regulator level what it is that we want from businesses. The idea is not to stop value creation. The idea is to help businesses to regenerate. And in order to do that, you need to look at this in an entrepreneurial way and not just in a system compliant way. So it's not about ticking boxes. It's about seizing new opportunities.
So I mean, it's great. Like, you know, it's great to sit here in an academic institution and think about system change and how we're going to drive system change, and that's part of what academic institutions are supposed to think about. And how can we sort of change the regulatory structure and change the priorities of business. At the same time, I mean, I think many of us feel a great sense of urgency. There was just a emissions gap report, and now I'll just talk about emissions because it's quantifiable, correct? But there's just a UN emissions gap report that said that there's a 97% chance that under current policies we'll blow through 2 degrees, and more than a third chance that we will blow through 3 degrees under current policies. And at the same time, in the biodiversity sphere, as you point out in the book, and as we all know, there's been this precipitous decline and a lot of species loss, and that's just accelerating. So there's this great sense of urgency, and I'm trying to sort of reconcile, when I read the book, I was trying to reconcile the sense of urgency that I and many others feel with the sorts of system change issues, which just seem like they would take decades in the United States.
So let's reinforce this notion of urgency. Yes, the ICCC, the International Climate Change Council, which is the United Nations body, which looks at carbon emission, talks about getting out of coal this year and of oil in 5 years. And that's when we can sort of keep it under 2 degrees. And that's just not going to happen. We all know that. Secretary General Guterres last week in Colombia, in Cali, talked about 3.1 degrees by 2030 if nothing changes. Now, how do you feel about that? There we are in full knowledge that the world is disappearing and that the climate is changing very rapidly. We're still being incredibly slow at reacting. The commitment signed off in Paris in 2015 are still not being respected. Whatever the agreement is going to be signed in Baku, and it's not going to be a good one because Azerbaijan is an oil-producing company, are going to be watering down these targets time and time. So there is an absolute emergency, and it's, you know, I don't need to tell you about science fiction. You can see it. The bushfire in Salem at the moment because of the 3-year drought. I mean, surely that's something real. Maybe it's just weather. Maybe it's not climate, but it might well be climate, and you know we should be disposing to prepare ourselves for that. So within the finite planetary boundaries, we cannot expect that this sort of thing will happen much more quickly if we need to change the system. The problem is that to change the system is an incredibly complex thing to do, and we need to make sure that we get the support of every single person, not necessarily in terms of action, but at least in terms of shared values. And I see an awful lot of people who are still saying it's not my problem. Well, I never thought I would be alive by the time all the glacier would have disappeared from the Alps. And now it's very possible. Sorry, I got a bit lost.
No. So that puts the time frame in perspective.
No,
that if we're actually operating a little bit more slowly than the glaciers are leaving the Alps, that is not encouraging.
But you know, I think I'm going to make myself very popular again by saying something very simple. Business managed on the short-term profit maximization, business managed on the principle of homo economicus, the one who always takes a decision that maximizes immediate benefit in full knowledge of the fact, that way of doing business has destroyed the planet. And I think we really need to agree on that. That's a baseline. You know, the status quo is not going to allow us to survive on this planet. So we need to change it. And to change it, we need to look at different ways of producing the sustainable prosperity, and that's the purpose of the book. You know, how can we make sure that for 10 billion people, for eternity, or for at least a little bit longer than what we do at the moment, we are going to be able to produce the value needed. And we need all hands on deck. It's not a question of saying that, oh, you know, the Chinese, I can't do anything because the Chinese are doing this, or the Americans are doing this, or the Russians are doing this. It's us, each one of us, individually. We need to move ahead into a way where we can have an influence on a sustainable basis. My recipe for that would be to say the first thing to do is to look after your own well-being. You know, don't do things you don't want to do just because you think that's what's expected of you. You know, do what you know is right. We all have common sense and we know how to do things. So again, I'm going to say something.
That's good. I mean, you know, one of the things that you discuss in the book, you mentioned at several points. You mentioned the Club of Rome. You mentioned degrowth at a couple of points. But I don't think, you know, I think degrowth, people think about, oh, we all just have to cut back on our absolute level of consumption. We have to reduce production. We have to reduce standards of living. And I don't think that that's what you're saying. I think that you're saying that companies have to take into account natural solutions, natural considerations, climate, and so forth, but at the same time continue to grow and continue to improve standard of living. And of course, there's so much of the world that doesn't have the benefits that you and I and developed economies have, where there's a moral requirement to improve standards of living. But the challenge then is how to do that and how companies can take the lead, not by reducing growth, but by actually being smarter about that. I don't think that's I should try to put a question mark at the end of that, but that's a...
No, I think the debate about growth is an interesting one. I think degrowth is dangerous because we're already at a very tense level. I like this notion of sufficiency, you know, grow enough. How do you define success? How much is enough? Is it really a question of filling up the bank account? Is it really important to have success by buying the nicest car and the nicest accessory? Or is success just what we were talking about before, you know, the self-well-being, behaving in a way that you can sort of do something for yourself? So the fundamental question is how do we define success and how much is enough? And then you go into this notion of how can you use the entrepreneurial genius, which we have really demonstrated. You know, business since 1960 or whatever has been incredibly efficient at doing what it wants to do. Sadly, it was using the wrong the wrong KPIs, the wrong statistics. If we can manage business for impact, we can restore the planet. We can bring it back to a level where it can continue for the long term, for the 10 billion people we were talking about before. This is not a plaidoyer for getting rid of all the system. It's a plaidoyer for trying to adapt the existing system to create this sustainable prosperity, which we really need, otherwise we're not going to go much further than that. So no degrowth. Degrowth is not the right approach. Sufficiency. Let's have enough. Let's not go over and over. I mean, what is it? 40% of the food produced on the planet is thrown away. Well, surely that's something we can do something about. Do we really need? Well, I'm not going to go into examples. You all have them. I mean, these are common sense approaches. You know, I like to talk about commons with an S sense. You know, how can we manage the global commons in a way that brings benefit to all? So it's not shareholder primacy. It's not me. It's us. The Club of Rome, you were mentioning before, has done this very interesting model called Earth for All. This is based on MIT model, you know, the computer model that was started at MIT 40 years ago, and which has now been updated recently, new publication 3 years ago. The single biggest cause of problem on the planet is inequalities. Inequalities between countries, but also between people. And that's something we can do about. That's, you know, these are social norms. We define them. It's us.
I could keep asking questions, but I bet the audience has some questions. So
Try to say a couple of provocative things in the hope that you will provoke me back.
let me open this up, please. And you know, I don't think we need mics. I think you can just speak from your seat.
But I hope you have me in the back. Did you?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe you could introduce yourself. As we. Okay.
I'm Catherine Watts-Stockford. I'm a senior research scientist with Chan School, and I also have a consulting company that works on these kinds of issues, biodiversity credits. One question is, we always talk about putting natural capital on the balance sheet, but given that profit maximization is the goal of corporates, it's the goal of shareholders, and we want to invest in nature, et cetera, et cetera. So what is the mechanism for putting nature on the income statement? Right, because we talk about investing in nature, but that ends up either being philanthropic or disclosure, et cetera, which isn't going to get anywhere. So that's one good. At the firm that I work for, we talk about developing a nature-backed currency. So we have a gold standard. We chose the gold standard. We said that. Why did we say? What if you had a nature-backed currency? What if you had sort of the nature standard, right? That's one thing.
That's music to my ears. We just had this conversation this morning.
But we struggle with that because in the current system, we also have to make money as a company, and you know all of those kind of things. And so you can say the words, but then how do you actually kind of translate that? That's one thing. The second thing is the whole degrowth thing, which is it's not that it's degrowth. It's not. When you think about growth, where in nature is uncontrolled or unrelenting growth rewarded, right? It's like cancer, parasites, right? And so it's not realistic to think that in an economy embedded in nature can grow. And why do you actually have to have growth to improve well-being? You don't actually have to have that. You can grow in art or music or creativity or, right? But as long as you have that profit maximization paradigm, that's where we get back to how can you put nature on the income statement? Because it's pretty easy to put it on the balance sheet, but the income statement is
So within planetary limit, I agree that growth is, and non-stopping growth is just not going to happen, just because we're going to hit a wall at some stage. So I agree that growth is not the best way of creating the sustainable prosperity. If you're talking about nature and income statement, this is so important because, first of all, 80 years after Bretton Woods, the current financial system is in need of a fix, is in need of a change. Yeah? I mean, we're dealing on trust at the moment. We're dealing on trust with something that we know is not working. We have this sort of approach of saying that the ledgers of the central banks are covering all the expense, and they're not, and we all know that. Yeah. So the moment we take the moment somebody comes out and says, "Look, this is not real," the whole field could collapse. You know? The story of the little boy who says the king is naked. Everybody says him dressed, but when he's naked, he's naked. So a lot of central bankers, and I talked to some of them, are worried about this. What do we do about the future? What if suddenly something major happens again? And so we've launched an initiative where we're trying to say that what we want to see going ahead is the new underlying of the economy. 80 years later, let's redefine what before the gold standard was, but what it's really. And can you imagine if we suddenly say that biodiversity is the underlying currency of our exchange of values? You know, in one single stroke, we solve a lot of issues. In particular, we revert wealth towards the developing country, from us. I mean, that would be, okay, it's a little bit of a fantasy, but I think there are people who are seriously thinking along those lines. And yes, when the group of the Mont Pelerin met 60 years ago to talk about liberal economy, nobody believed them, and you see what happened. So it's something that we should be thinking about. One. Second is how do we create a nature market? And there are a couple of initiatives over the years which have worked. The traditional one is tourism. You know, you pay to go to Africa. Okay, well, you know, it's small. It's a huge industry, but it's a small contribution to the total. We've recently had a couple of efforts into trading in carbon credits or into biodiversity credits. Not there yet, but you know, could be something. Those who know how to trade with nature are the commodity traders. They do that every day, and they put nature on the balance sheet. You know,
Yeah.
they don't really do it in a way which I find particularly attractive, but they do it. You know, and so let's try to pull all that together. And I'm just giving this example because I think it's something. It's doable if we apply the right minds at the right level. I'm a great believer that you can only get the right answer if you ask the right question. And as long as the question is it profitable, this is not the right question. You know, and so how can we...
Unless you redefine profit. You say your this is, and I was talking to an IFC economist who said, you know, this is actually quite simple. If the central banks send the signal and say, your profit is going to depend on nature positive, right? Naturepositive.org, it's this whole nature positive thing that everybody sort of talks about but isn't really doing anything about. He said if you actually send that signal, everything changes kind of relatively quickly. Because it is something we created, right? We can define that and we can redefine it.
For me, the major difference here is the difference between private and public. You know, central bankers, their client is the citizen. Private banker, their client is a client, and you have to satisfy it. And you know, I completely understand that. The fiduciary duty of banks when they manage monies that are not theirs is to increase the profit. That's what we ask them to do. But in a system view, we have to go back to public approach.
Let's get some other, oh my goodness, okay, so in the center there.
So this morning, looking at the news, there was 5 meters of rain that fell in Valencia, Spain in 8 hours.
5?
5 meters.
Is that-
491 millimeters of rain fell
Really?
in 8 hours.
Yeah.
So that's more than his room, you know.
Equivalent of a year of rain.
1 year. So this entire room would have been flooded, not because of rivers, but just because what fell out of the sky.
So this was yesterday, it fell
Well,
like...
the 30th of October, Valencia time, so over.
Yeah,
So-
And those who've been to Valencia know that it never rains.
Yeah, so my question is, so like, clearly, these extremes, tomorrow here in Boston, we're gonna break a record for Halloween and the temperature. It's gonna be a nice balmy 77, 78 degrees.
Great, short
I'm
sleeves.
breaking 80.
So we have these different things. One of the things that my question is, look, I'm in private equity. I went to INSEAD for my MBA.
Well done.
And the question I have is related to the business schools with it, because my son's in high school, you know, and the amount that it costs for education right now is crazy. Either you have no money and then you get financial aid, or you have to make an incredible amount to pay $70,000 to $100,000 a year to put it in debt to go in for your child for 4 years to claw out of it. And so one of the things that I see is that we're turning the rat race faster and faster, and social media is doing the same thing. We're manufacturing anxiety. And I think also part of it with climate change is also manufacturing anxiety. So what do? So we go back and we get our little dopamine hit when we go onto the phone. Needless to say, these things aren't happening with the climate change solutions, as you mentioned, Paris in 2015 and the others, because big business is fundamentally bankrolling and controlling a lot of the policy decisions. And that's part of the lobbying effort. So given that I agree, everybody on this planet, we're swimming in the same pool. We're all in the same thing. So what I haven't heard, and I put out there, is that what thoughts do we have to slow things down and to look at solutions without simply feeding more fear? Because when I see fear, I see what the reaction is that fundamentally people say, all right, I gotta take care of myself first, make money, and then I'll solve the world. So I
Which is
just
going to be difficult to spend that same money if there is no earth left. But I think the question contains its answer. You know, I don't think that the lobbying of the defense of the status quo is only interested in profit and blocking things. It's more interested in instilling a bit of doubt into what we're doing. You know, it's not really anthropogenic. It's not really happening. An electric vehicle is much more expensive than a car. You know, all these things are not. You know, you make it sound like if it is just violence. It's not just violence. It's much worse than that, and it has consequences for the long term. You know, none of our pronouncement based on facts and based on science about the climate can be taken as is because somebody else somewhere has written somewhere that something has been different. And that is something that worries me much more because we have instilled this sort of notion of doubt, which I think is dangerous in the long term. And it's dangerous for the applying of the solution and not just for the definition of the problem. Now, I love the idea of slowing down, but you know, climate change, global warming means more energy in the system because more heat stays into the troposphere, and when it comes back, it is more violent. I mean, 5 meters in Sevilla could be, I don't know, 200 kilometers away, wind here. There is inherently more energy in the system, and when it's restituted, it's more violent. It's as simple as that, really. So we don't really have the luxury of slowing things down. So we need to react.
Did you have? Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Esther Gabriel. I'm a third-year law student, and I'm from the South Pacific. I'm from Fiji. So my question is maybe your suggestion of something that is an entrepreneurial genius for a community that has focused on what is sufficient. That is our whole world. We do live in the commons. We come from this world, which you are encouraging us, and I do believe that is where we should go. So for a community that's there already, but who is struggling in this moment, what is maybe an entrepreneurial genius that we can do? Because this is directly related to the work I'm trying to do.
So the word genius was because I wanted to gain the attention of you.
Okay.
Maybe just know-how would be good enough, you know. But yeah, the economy of island countries, which are immediately threatened by the water rise, you know, where do you start? There is only a possibility of using the international convention system, which is trying to explain the consequences of the rise of water to a number of countries, and then suddenly we go away from the private to the public. And you know, capitalism does 3 things. I mean, one is asset allocation, one is risk management, and the third thing is competition. To manage competition in order to lower CO2, because it's going to be more expensive, we need public intervention. We need public-private partnerships. And the cases of small islands has been very well used in different conventions to be able to use to influence the agenda.
Jim, can I maybe?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Please. Yeah, Peter.
You know, one of the things that I find very interesting in this discussion of what can companies do, what can entrepreneurs is your question. You know, we looked at a couple of cases of companies and company leaders who sort of reinterpreted what it is their company was about and what it is they did. And if I give maybe just 2 examples that stood out to me, and that you can also find in our book. The first was of Schneider Electric. Schneider Electric, for those of you who may have been in France at some point in time, you know, they used to be the company that made these light switches. Very, you know, old school engineering company, and an unsexy company, if you will. They have become one of the largest public companies in France and in Europe in the past 10 years by virtue of their leadership reinventing the company on the basis of helping their clients, companies, reduce their energy consumption. Because of their knowledge in electricity, etc., they managed to turn that into a business model. So they've had stratospheric growth as a company in financial terms. But basically, by helping others reduce their energy consumption and therefore, let's say, help solve one of the crises that we've talked about, that's a really interesting way of reinterpreting yourself as a company by not questioning, in fact, what you said earlier, which is the growth model, right? They still have had a lot of real growth as a company, but in a way that doesn't harm the planet, if you will. And then the other company that I found very interesting in our research was IKEA. Because at IKEA, which is a company that I love, by the way, as a consumer, the leadership sort of realized that their customers did not want to pay, despite their desires to help create a better planet, let's say, did not want to pay for that. They didn't, and they couldn't probably in many cases. And so what they did is, well, how else can we solve the problem here? And one of the ways that they managed to do so is by saying, well, we're going to become our own second-hand store. And so they buy back products from their customers and then sell them back at a lower price than it cost initially to other customers, leading again to higher revenues for the company and growth for the company, but to a better and a more sustainable and circular system. And I think if you talk about, to get back to this, entrepreneurial genius, I find that genius. Because there are still companies that operate in the capitalist system. They still pursue growth and profit, but they do so in a way while they also contribute to natural capital and in some cases also human and social capital.
And what I find so powerful in that example is that it's not just a logic of consuming and getting rid of. It's by inventing a new model that the customer didn't want, you actually create a better solution because you create a market that did not exist. That's what I mean by entrepreneurial genius, even if the term is a bit exaggerated. And if I bring it back to Fiji, I'm sure there are solutions which are Fijian-based by Fijian for making a difference what's happening there, if you ask the right question. and that's exactly what Jesper and his team did at IKEA. They came by saying, well, the customer tells us he doesn't want that. Well, let's give him something else, but which would get to the same place.
Thank you for coming. I'm Louise. I'm originally from Belgium, and I'm currently working for a technology that provides low-carbon chemicals, specifically methanol, to the market. But as a European, the big question that I have is, what does Europe need to do? Because you're seeing on the one hand, Europe has been very ambitious in putting stakes and putting the ETS program in place and putting penalties on industry. And right now we're getting a lot of backlash where the question is our industry is getting not competitive, we're struggling with energy prices, etc., etc. And so there's kind of that balance of Europe has been ambitious, but now we're paying the bill for it relative to other continents. And so wondering what you think Europe at this point needs to do in terms of continuing on that ambition while preserving its industries and its competitive edge.
Two things. We were talking about the pushback of industry to defend the status quo. A lot of big corporations, not because they are evil, but because they are trying to defend their business model, have sort of seeded this idea that Europe is regulating itself out of competitivity. There's a very strong pushback saying we cannot work and create value for European citizens if we are imposed this sort of model. And you've seen it over the last 3 years. I mean, the idea of taxing at the border products which have more carbon is under danger. The mobility bill about the German car industry is also not going to go through. I mean, you can see there's a very potent activity in trying to push back that particular thing. Now, if you look at the world and if you look at the big bloc, that's the second point. If you look at China, if you look at America, if you look at Southeast Asia, if suddenly everything goes because you need to grow, which is what one of the candidates is proposing, I'll leave it at that. You're going to be able to. You're going to need somebody somewhere who keeps a sort of moral thinking. If you look at the history of Europe, it's not something that happened over the last 400 years. It's 2,000 years of war and conflict which have led to something. And the fact that this moral authority is trying to impose standards on the world by putting its own competitivity at risk is something that I really applaud. This is fantastic. It's good news. You know, we need Europe to set these standards. Who has regulated the data flows in the world? It's not the GAFAs, it's not the Magnificent Sevens, it's Europe, you know? And so that regulation is something that we should sort of support. But of course, it has a cost. It has a cost that you might regulate yourself into relative difference. I mean, talking to Keith here in particular, the use of data in Europe is nowhere the medical data because there is too much protection. Here in the US, medical data is available according to certain criteria, in Asia even more, which means that everything that has to do with health and data and with medicine in the rest of the world is more advanced than it is in Europe, and Europe is accumulating a retirement. But it is defending the private sphere, which is what we own, you know. Not easy. But I do think that one of the things we would really miss if we stopped this approach from the European Union would be this defense of value. I don't want to call it morality, it's not the right word. Defense of value, which we need.
I guess if I could just take the liberty to just make a comment on this question too, because it's a very interesting one, given not just the debates about European industrial competitiveness, but also a lot of the pushback at the level of the individuals in Europe. And I guess I would have a more optimistic view, and I'd be interested in your thoughts. And you mentioned in passing the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is now going into place, which actually has multiple effects, but one of them is actually providing some of the insulation to these industries in terms of their external, are their international competitors going to be able to outprice them and because of lower energy, and now that they won't be able to, or lower carbon costs. But the other thing it's doing, and this is getting more to the moral leadership side, or maybe it's self-interested leadership side, is that that's putting a lot of pressure on other countries to adopt at least limited carbon pricing measures, because either if they don't pay, if they don't collect the tax revenues, then Europe's just going to collect the tax revenues for them. So if they want to be able to trade with Europe without being subject to the border adjustment, it's in their interest to adopt a carbon tax. So it seems like it could have these positive spillovers, despite the fact that it's a challenging situation at the moment for Europe.
You know, if we do believe, and I think we all believe here, that protecting the future is important, so we need to put down standards which are going to make sure that the future is prosperous. Europe, by doing this, takes a risk because it moves quicker than other communities. But if it does, if our scenario fulfills itself, Europe will be in a position where it can, as you say, benefit from tax situations somewhere else. So maybe it's a gamble worth doing. I mean, they teach you that in marketing class, no? You need to differentiate. Well, Europe is differentiating, and I think that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Oh, that's true, and it's driving innovation internationally.
It certainly is.
Please.
Thank you. Hi, thank you for being here. I'm Charlene. I work with a lot of leaders who care about this topic, care about thriving futures. I'm also quite skilled as a facilitator with teams to get people to care and to connect to nature and to their future. But then the gap between caring and really feeling skilled to actually make change is where it also leads to a lot of existential angst. And so my curiosity is, are there some great models, case studies, innovative governance models? Like, I'd love to do my own research to be more skilled in taking that care and that awareness into implementing that in their organization. So I'm curious about, within an organization, how can we structure based on what's already been tested, proven. I'm also curious about a more ecosystem model, such as having some organizations that are great profit vehicles, but they are an ecosystem that works with other organizations that are less about profit, because it's a great skill to be able to create a lot of financial resource. And so how can we do, not necessarily make that wrong, but have that be part of a more ecological perspective? And so I'm just curious, where can I become better at helping organizations and leaders actually do that?
Peter, do you want to take that one?
You know, Andre, one of the things I found most striking when we talked is that you've undergone an evolution where you've changed your own personal focus from spending your money to making money in a better way. And so, you know, I found this very, very interesting. So this is one of the world's greatest philanthropists who
Sorry, go on.
you know, correct me if I'm wrong, Andre, but basically you've run upon the limits of philanthropy at a certain level where you say, you know, we actually do need sustainability. Also means that if you are working on providing a public good, those organizations also need financial sustainability. And so part of your agenda that I've seen is sort of integrating the two. But maybe you should weigh in on that part of the question where do you still believe in the two separate, or should all organizations have that sustainability built in where they're able to make their own money or to make their own sustainability?
You know, Indra Nooyi, who used to be the lead of Pepsi Cola, had a saying which I've adopted. You know, it's not how you spend the money that matter; it's how you make it. And if you really want to do a difference in the planet, you know, you can give money to the World Wide Fund for Nature, 5 million members, a turnover of $1 billion, or you can influence Roche, 100,000 employees. 121 million people took our drugs last year. I'm not going to give you the turnover. You know, that influence to do that properly by using the proper way of looking at sustainable prosperity is a much more potent way of changing the planet than it is by doing just philanthropy. If you talk about climate, I mean, the amounts needed to change the system are so much bigger than what philanthropy can offer that it is not even open for conversation. It's just a no-go. But I'm not sure if this was just about philanthropy. We are talking about company running huge cash flows. We come back to this notion of sufficiency. You know, do you really need to have 3 or 4 years in the bank if you have a model that allows you to cover the cost every year? I mean, I'm a little bit of an entrepreneur myself, so I understand how interesting it is to have security in the future. But at some stage, there has to be an efficient model, and I'm not quite sure what it is.
I guess the question is to take it beyond concept and philosophy, which is things like putting nature on the balance sheet, and what are some, as of now, things that are developed that support organizations to really make that change, to take it from a mindset and implement that into their organization. So I see a lot of organizations who do that, who then sacrifice profit. So there's a lot of organizations that are either philanthropy or they just are not very sustainable because they care so much. And then there's the other spectrum. And it's like, how do we have more organizations that are kind of in the middle that integrate this idea, and how do you actually, as a leader, set up your business to really support this idea?
First of all, and quite clearly, there's not one size fits all. There's not a recipe. You know, it depends on each situation, and it depends on each situation run on the principle that you want to do exactly what you described. In Roche, we have defined our value: courage, integrity, passion. These are the 3 values we want to see into the dealing of the company, and that includes exactly what you've just described. So a purpose, value-driven organization is much more likely to get to this sort of level than something which is just focusing on profit. So you talked about sacrificing profitability. I mean, already the whole language associated with that is pretty painful. You know, if you do the right thing, it might well be that you don't need to go into sacrificial mode.
Thank you.
So another in the back there.
Thank you for coming. I'm David Kenny. I'm the executive of Nielsen, but 9 years ago I was at COP21 as the head of the weather company. I left there quite confident that we were on a good path. And in the 9 years since, most of the people who signed faced elections from citizens. So there's completely different leaders. And the citizens have been increasingly confused or cynical about this topic because the media has lost a lot of their ability to tell the story. Business is the one thing that citizens still trust. Do you think businesses have to play more of a role in educating citizens? Do we have to be more involved in the political process to keep an alignment between the public and the private sector? Because I don't see this happening in private sector alone.
If I look at the big groups which are going to be able to change the system, politician, 4-year horizon, as you just described, very difficult for them to make long-term decisions. NGOs, they have to satisfy their members, and when they go to these conventions, and I've been on the board of a number of them, I still fund a couple of them. What you look is controversy because you need to show that you're doing your work. You need to demonstrate to your members we showed something, we did something. You could look at universities. Big universities are doing a lot of knowledge, are creating a lot of values. They're not really putting it in place because everybody can do his own, just that much. You can look at churches, but I mean that's something I don't really understand, and I don't get engaged with that at all. Or you can look. No, you Americans are quite convinced about the big foundations. It's Jeff, it's Bill who are going to save us. I have my doubts. Yeah. Elon. I forgot Elon. Sorry.
Yeah, Elon's going to save us.
Elon's going to save. Huge firepower and just one single person deciding it can't work. But anyway. But if you look at businesses managed for impact and not just managed for profit, then you could start saying something. The politicians would welcome a long-term thinking coming from companies. And by definition, if you are working on impact, you are thinking long-term, because if you're not thinking long-term, you cannot measure the impact you're having. So there is, I think, there sort of alliance that we could see between the regulator and businesses, the new public-private partnership that we really want to see in action, which could be something quite, but it needs to be done on the basis of the common good. We need to use common sense, and that's something we need to talk more about.
Businesses need the skill to do it.
Yeah, but again, if we don't start at the beginning, if we don't ask the right question, it's not going to happen. Just saying, the politicians have lost interest. Damn, it's our future. It's us. We can't just let it go. Sorry.
Thank you. Obviously fantastic, André, to see you and have you here. André and I worked together for many years, and
He started very young.
that's right. And I've had the good fortune of building a company from zero, taking it public, running it with thousands of employees, taking it private, doing lots of different things over time. And I will tell you that the productivity of the employees, especially in technology companies, is what drives the company, right? I mean, your assets walk out the door each night, as they say, and in today's world, there isn't a door that they're walking out. They're working wherever they're working. And companies work incredibly hard to move basis points of profitability margins, but yet to move the productivity level of employees, you measure in hundreds of basis points often. I mean, dramatically larger amounts. And today's generation, increasingly your generation, is more motivated by mission and purpose and motivated by what and how they're going to do something, or as Simon Sinek would put it, the why. Companies that focus and are able to deliver on that providing that purpose and the desire to work harder because you believe in what you're doing is an enormous factor. And then it drives even companies like Microsoft to give $1.6 billion to 3 Mile Island to use nuclear energy to offset the increase of their data centers' power consumption. Companies are wanting the consumer and their employee to believe in the why, and that is a hugely motivating force. Far more than many other forces, especially in technology. So I would argue, first I want to the answer to your question before you. What can companies do is make sure they emphasize the why and the purpose and the mission, and that they care, and it will attract a different type of employee. employee
It's in the book.
and a lower turnover rate. Turnover costs companies enormous amounts of money. Every single Sunday, I get a KPI index that tells me exactly our turnover, exactly our cost of replacement, so on and so forth. It's a significant dollar amount, but it's even more significant, cost and ramp up to get that person back to, the replacement person back to the knowledge base that just walked out the door. So companies care about this, and then to the degree that the work that André and others are focused on, can we create measurable, comparable metrics? The other thing companies love is competing, right? So if at least there's a measuring stick, let me beat my competition. Let me make a better product, let me make a better impact on society, but give me a measuring stick, and I'll also show my shareholders that I'm doing good for them as well. And some of those measuring sticks aren't as obvious as others, and people are working on how to figure them out. But creating a measuring stick, however imperfect it may be initially, as so many of the other FASB rules and other things are, start to at least create a level playing field for a company to say, okay, at least I know the rules. If you measure it, I can play in this game, and I'll do better than others. But there's a lot of these soft factors. But I will tell you, companies today want people to care. They want their customer to care. They want their employee to care. They want to create an environment that rewards for that. And these factors factor into it, I think, tremendously.
You touch on a point which I consider as absolutely crucial. As an employer, I don't want people who come to me because they want a salary, the holidays, the weekends. I want them to come to me because together we're going to do something for the patient. Together we co-create, we do something that is efficient for patients. And I give them the opportunities to realize what it is that they need to do to get to the point to which they want to come. So that's the why you were just talking about. Now, I see a lot of companies where this doesn't happen, and when you develop, people come and are forced to do things that do not correspond to their own values. They are forced to do something which they believe is what the world expects from them. Very often it's not the case, by the way. It's often self-inflicted. And if you want to buy the car, if you want your partner not to leave you, or if you want to be promoted, or you need to behave in a certain way, which is not necessarily the one that makes you happy. That's, when you're behaving in a way which is contrary to what you believe, that's a pathology. It's schizophrenia. You should get a doctor. And I think that's something that we, around us, I see a lot of people who are behaving, who are throwing themselves into a trap which is not really needed. Just be yourself. Just have the courage of saying from time to time, that's not the way I want to do it. And if my employer is a piece of shit, well, then I'll go. That's fine. It should not be forbidden. But I think we're taking the same thing. It's in a book, which you can buy, by the way.
Yeah.
Tom Mahoney, I'm a senior fellow in the Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative and also affiliated with the School of Public Health, Immunology, and Infectious Disease. So, wonderful, provocative presentation, very important and timely book. In your enumeration of the multiple hazards of climate change, one of the things I was surprised as a senior corporate leader of one of the world's largest pharma companies you did not mention is the impact on the burden of infectious disease across the global south, looking at the dispersion and the propagation of vectors, looking at what floods do to cholera outbreaks. The list goes on. You know it better than I. You're in the business. Leaving aside the ability to mitigate this effect on human health, particularly falling on the world's most vulnerable and marginal populations in these resource-constrained settings, right? And understanding that changing climate the right way would be one remediation, but probably not the quickest one. What do you think we can do to recruit the pharma industry to come back to the table instead of retreating from the fight against this horde of pathogenic invaders that's been with us for all of human history, is only getting worse with climate change, right? In their quest for short-term profits in things like GLP-1 receptor agonists and other wonderful shiny objects that shareholders like better. That doesn't end well for humanity when obesity, which we know is a comorbidity indication for infectious syndromes, that may be true, is going to kill a lot less people than malaria, TB, HIV/AIDS, dengue now, and many other indications we can think about coming at us soon.
So absolument touché, you're right, I should have mentioned that. This is not a question of, you know, I'm trying to not focus just on climate. That's why I'm not sort of, but what we really are talking, you know, carbon capture is about CO2. It's about the organic chemistry. We are carbon. You know, the sort of thing we need to do as a company like Roche is to save life. And if you want to save life, you also need to save biodiversity. You need to save nature. It's very intimately linked. And you know, there is this wonderful example. One of the economists of the World Bank has published this report about how much carbon is absorbed by a blue whale. You know, it's about 10,000 tons over a period of, I don't remember the statistics. I would have to look them up. But you know, this is real carbon capture. There used to be nearly 130,000, 300,000 of these whales. They're now back to 100 or 150. You know, we are shooting ourselves in the foot by eating the whale. Anyway, that's just an aside. So one health, one planet is incredibly important as an approach. Now, having said that, how do we get companies to bring back to antimicrobial resistance? How do we recreate this economy? As a business model, it doesn't work because if you find an antibiotic that works for the microbes, the important thing is to not use it, because the moment you start using it, you develop resistance. So you put it in the shelf and you use it really once every 10,000 cases or every 100,000 cases. So barely a business model, yeah. Unless it hits you. And when it hits you, when you really have a real antimicrobial resistance, and that's not infectious diseases coming from the other part of the world, it's in our hospitals today. You know, if you want the day it really hits us, we will have to be ready, and at the moment we are not. So we at Roche have a program in that respect because we can afford to, because of the size of the business. But I can understand that if you want to incentivize this, you're going to have to create some sort of public-private partnership. And there are things afoot. You know, the World Health Organization, especially now under the leadership of Jeremy Farrar, is doing a lot of work in that direction. I don't have a clean answer. I'm sorry.
Yeah, in the back, please.
Hi, my name is Greg Byer. I'm an entrepreneur building a platform to price sustainability across the entire financial architecture. And I'm curious to what your thoughts are as to why is Europe so consistently ahead of the U.S.
Sorry, stop it. You don't have to say anything else. I agree. Sorry. Go on. Yeah.
No, what are the key drivers for Europe consistently and so deeply being ahead of the United States in sustainability? For example, I recently learned that in Amsterdam it's illegal to advertise for, cruises or SUVs or flights in the city center and Amsterdam. So I'm just curious, because it promotes consuming carbon. So I'm just curious what you think the drivers are, and I'm also curious what is your sort of fundamental optimistic view on how this will all work out?
Well, I don't think I can answer the second part, but the first part, what is the main cultural difference between Europe and the US? I think that's, Europe, and we're going to have to talk about democracy. I'm sorry, there's no going away from politics. When the settlers were sent, when the settlers sent away the invading countries and threw the tea in the water and did that sort of thing, one of the main reasons why they did that is because they wanted to retain the earning streams for themselves and not for somebody else. So the instauration of a democracy, we the people, the 52 white men who signed this, we the people is an attempt at protecting the market. In Europe, the borders, the democracy, the system that has been used as a result of thousands of years of war. The borders are very different. And so the democratic system in Europe has been set in order to fix borders, to make sure that countries are countries. So Germany, Italy. That's one of the reasons why, for instance, the US is still convinced that putting sanctions on Russia would make a difference. The Russians have been under sanction for 300 years. They couldn't care less, but no, it's true. I mean, for Americans, it's difficult to understand because the market is what dominates all here. And that might well be a reason why, Nobel Prize winner Milton Friedman in 1976, that might well be a reason why this focus on short-term profit maximization encourages a different approach again, of the definition of success and of the long-term thinking. Europe has a different perspective on that. So maybe it is a question of democracy. Maybe it is a question of different thinking. Maybe it's a question of, yes, this generation after generation of thinkers who have shot themselves in the foot several times, who have killed each other. Maybe that's all linked to it. So it's a complex answer to a very complex question.
Oh, please, Janine.
Hi, I'm Janine Cavender-Bears. I'm a professor in organism and evolutionary biology. Just got back from the COP16 for the UN Convention on Biodiversity and the Global Biodiversity Framework. You've already answered some of the questions I had, which were about thinking about biodiversity at the same time as climate. There were some examples presented there of green subsidies that were granted in the UK that coal companies then use to cut pristine forests and turn it into pellets for burning, so that led to perverse and unintended consequences by just focusing on climate and not biodiversity at the same time. So I really appreciate your perspective that these things have to be managed together. So you keep mentioning that it's really about the question you ask to get the answer you want, and that you have to measure the things that you need to be able to manage. So I guess my question is, what are your thoughts on how we measure what we want to manage to get the outcomes that we want?
Well, if we're looking at how biodiversity as part of the mix, no, sorry, I lost my thread. You can measure what you manage means that you need to be able to go much more granular, and for that an awful lot of science is helping us to understand what the different factors are. Now, one thing we have to realize, and we have to all accept, is that nature is not linear. You cannot take this engineer model of saying A plus B equals C is the only way to look at nature. Nature is infinitely more complex. Nature is chaotic. Nature is a re-establishing balance permanently. And nature is incredibly local. It's very different here than it is next door. So the idea of creating a system where everybody finds themselves at an international conference and you fix a formula which allows everybody to manage nature, it really has to be put aside. This is not the way it works. It works in a chaotic way, and we need to accept that nature is not quantifiable in a way that is purely linear. Now, it's difficult for a human to say that because we want simplification. We want it to be easy to work with. But I think we are going to have to accept that if we really want to make a difference to this particular subject, we're going to have used two big values. One is humility, just listen before you decide. When you say unintended consequences, very often in complex systems, if you overprivilege one of the variables, you get some distortion at the end. You get some collateral damages. I mean, if you say that CO2 is the only way to deal with climate, then you do exactly what you say. You plant, you cut the old forest and you plant a new one because it absorbs more carbon. Or you focus just on replanting, and that's not going in the long run to manage the issue either. So if you really want to be able to continue to do that, you need to be able to manage CO2. No, sorry, we're not talking about CO2 here. Sorry, I'm starting to have the effect of jet lag. I lose my thread a bit, sorry. Yeah. But CO2, in capturing it just as a single description of the system is not going to be enough. You need to create a pyramid of needs. I don't know if that answers the question, sorry.
I think, true. We have time for a quick question, and I want to make sure I get the last question.
I think that's exactly what Kami was hoping, yes.
quick question.
Thank you for organizing this. My name is Kami. I used to be at the college, and I run a climate tech company. My question is about how do we elevate the ability of leaders, whether it be in business, in politics, at universities, to take a more courageous stance. Because fundamentally, what I've noticed in my now almost 20 years of working in the climate space, that there is a willingness to talk about these concepts sort of in an academic sense, but when it comes down to it, in a conversation, there is not a willingness to create conflict when you're at the top of sort of the food chain within our society, whether it be as a business person, whether it be running a university, whether it be in politics. There's a few exceptions, one of them being the B team leaders that André is a part of. And so I'm wondering, how can we accelerate that? Because ultimately it's going to require us to make these changes. It's going to require us to make uncomfortable decisions. It's going to require decisions where in the short term, Europe is going to be quote unquote less competitive. And we're not going to accelerate that change if we're not able to increase sort of the civil courage amongst the leaders. Have you found a way amongst the B team or in other areas of how to do that, how to get leaders to take a stand in uncomfortable situations, to risk being fired, to risk having major scrutiny put upon them?
So maybe I can give the example of the Global Institute for Business and Society at INSEAD, which my wife and I created 7 years ago. And there we started as a program to look at how the school can contribute to the debate, INSEAD being a business school, how we can contribute to the debate by research, by teaching, and by convening. How can we sort of make sure that these things happen? And then we realized after 5 years of rather successful amendments to the curriculum, the MBA is now taught differently at INSEAD than it was 4 years ago, thanks to the work of this institute. We realized that it was not really enough. We need to make sure that we call back the alums and that we give them the 6th period of what they should be studying. How can we fine-tune, how can we re-evaluate what they have done by introducing this notion of planetary limits, of limits. And so that means that a business school active in Fontainebleau and in Singapore calls back its alums and talk to them about 2 things. One is, how do we engage the South? So how do we create partnership where we can take the sort of decision you described in conjunction with people in developing countries, in the least developed economies? And I think that's a very important part of it. And the second thing is, how do we create the safe space that you just mentioned? How can we make sure that these leaders, when they come to us, have an opportunity to challenge what they have done until now, and to at least in their mind get a little bit clearer about what they have to do. How they translate that into their business afterwards is something that depends very much of their local constellation. They need to be able to look at it in a way that will work for them. So there's not a system answer to that. There's really a granular answer. But Peter?
I wanted to add something, which is, as a journalist, I talk to a lot of CEOs and business leaders about how they lead. And one thing that I found really remarkable when it came to their sort of leaning into a broader role in society was that almost invariably, and I found this extremely striking, almost invariably, people had sort of like a light bulb moment. These leaders had a light bulb moment that involved very often a younger person that they had a conversation with, and that sort of made them change the way they look themselves, their company, and their role in the world. And I found that very remarkable, because I didn't see it once or twice. I saw it in many, many different cases. It was often a child, a young activist they ran into, another young person, and so to your question, I think a part of it may be that that leaders have to lean into their own humanity a little bit more. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And so maybe one way, of course, if you want to institutionalize it, is that you have more companies that use their own internal levers to promote people that have that emotional intelligence or that humanity more. Another way, which unfortunately has been a model so far, is that you just have to have luck of the draw that these people run into somebody that influences them in that way.
What you asked is the question about leadership. What does it mean how do you gain over the opinion of the people you work with? I mean, in the past it used to be like this, now it's like this, and it works very well.
Well, I think that's a good note to end this on, and we are at time. So I'd like to thank you very much, both Peter and Andre, for sharing these thoughts with us. My understanding is that we have some snacks or something like that, right? Somewhere. Okay. And so, you know, you might have an opportunity to come up and say hello, and let's thank our speakers.